Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is Sarah Elaine Eaton. I'm the convener of the webinar series, Academic Integrity, Urgent and Emerging Topics. It's my pleasure and honor today to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. John Paul Fox from Ryerson University, who's here to talk to us about visual plagiarism. Just wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that we're joining you today. I say we, I mean those of us who are situated at the University of Calgary from the Treaty 7, people of the Treaty 7 territory. And also wanted to acknowledge the city of Calgary, the place I now call home. It's also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I would invite you in the chat to introduce yourselves to us, to let us know where you're joining in from today and what territory you might also be joining in from if you're from Canada. I also wanted to offer a special welcome to our international guests who are here with us today. As you're typing your introduction into the chat, I just wanted to go over a couple of quick housekeeping details. As with all of our webinars, today's session will be recorded. The participant names will not be captured in the recording, and nor will the chat. And normally the recordings are posted on the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning website, as well as the Institute's YouTube page. With that in mind, we would invite you to keep your microphones and your cameras off because it helps with the overall quality of the recording. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand things over to John Paul. John Paul, the floor is yours and welcome.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And may I start by saying how much I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to come and to speak with you and those joining us today. So thank you very much. I'm really honored to have the chance to come and share my perspectives. So as Sarah said, my name is John Paul Fox and I work at Ryerson University. And before we go too much further, I too want to begin with a land acknowledgement. Many of you will know that Ryerson University is situated in the heart of downtown Toronto in Ontario. However, I am coming to you from the heart of my kitchen in the east end of Toronto, which is just, I'm just north of the beaches for any of you who are familiar with Toronto geography. So Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So there's a couple of things, I don't want to call them housekeeping items, but a couple of important things I want to do before we get started. The first of which was the land acknowledgement. The second thing I want to do is just take a minute and talk about a brand new publication. I happen to have the hard copy here in my hand, and I think Sarah has one with her as well. So this is a book called Academic Integrity in Canada, an enduring and essential challenge. It is hot off the press. It is only very recently published. The co-editors are Sarah Elaine Eaton, our facilitator and host today, as well as Julia Christensen Hughes. And I have to say, Sarah and Julia put in what can only be described as Herculean efforts in making this publication a reality. We owe them as a community so much for all of their work, not just in this publication, but more broadly speaking in the field of academic integrity. So I really want to take the time to try and make you all aware of this wonderful publication. Now, the best part of all of this is it is open access and free to all of you. Julia was able to make that happen. So I really very strongly encourage you to try and take a look at this book. I hope it's not a spoiler to say that this is the first in the planned series of books. There is so much really fantastic stuff in here, so please take the time to look at it. The other thing I want to mention is that I am co-author, and I do stress the word co-author, of a chapter in this book called Visual Plagiarism, Seeing the Forest and the Trees. And these are my co-authors on the chapter. And a lot of what I will be talking about today comes from my co-authors. And in fact, many of them have actually provided many of the images that I'll be using in today's presentation. So really, while I am the one speaking to you today, this is work that has come from us as a team. So the team is Alison Miller, who works very closely with me in the Academic Integrity Office as an academic integrity specialist at Ryerson. Glenn Farrelly, who is currently a faculty member at Athabasca University in Business Communications and formerly of Ryerson, which is how we got to know each other. Vincent Huey from Architecture at Ryerson, Diane Nubla, who I'm fairly sure is with us today on the call, from Professional Communication at Ryerson, and then finally Colleen Schindler-Lynch, who is an associate professor in the School of Fashion at Ryerson. So I want to acknowledge and to thank all of my co-authors for all of their efforts and all of their great work and their expertise before I go any further. So before I worked in academic integrity, I was an educational developer at Ryerson for 6 years. And educational developers love to talk about learning outcomes. So that's where I'm going to start today. So by the end of this webinar, participants hopefully will be able to define and describe visual plagiarism, as well as develop instructional practices that will help to prevent visual plagiarism in their discipline. A couple of things I want to say about this. So I'm not always successful, but I try to choose my words carefully. And I have used the word participants here. You all as an audience are more than an audience, you are participants. And I strongly encourage you to participate and engage in today's conversation. If talking were an Olympic sport, I could win a medal. I talk a lot. People could very reasonably accuse me of loving the sound of my own voice. I actually don't. I bore myself. So it would be much more fun for me and for all of you if you would engage in the conversation through the chat, and Sarah is going to help moderate the chat for us today. So please do contribute as we go through this. The other thing I want to point out to you is I am not a discipline-specific expert. So I am not an architect. I am not in fashion. God knows I am not an illustrator. I struggle to draw a stick man. I do, however, know a little bit about academic integrity, and I do know a little bit about instructional practices. So that's really what the focus of the conversation is going to be about today. We're going to embed the conversation within the disciplines, but all of the various strategies that we talk about today, I want you to think about how you might apply those to your own disciplines. So moving forward, what are we talking about when we say visual plagiarism? So visuals and visual plagiarism can mean a lot of specific things, but I want to try and focus the conversation for us all today. When I talk about visuals, I'm talking about visuals that convey meaning without dependence on language. So a photograph, for example, is an example of a visual that can convey meaning without dependence on language. A fashion design, architectural plans, these are the types of visuals that I'm talking about. The other thing I want to do before we go too much further is to talk about the difference, just very briefly, between visual plagiarism and copyright infringement. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, there's quite a lot of overlap between these two things, and there will certainly be overlap in the conversation today. However, when I speak about visual plagiarism, I am talking about when a policy, an institutional policy, is broken. When we talk about copyright infringement, we're talking about when a law is broken. So those are the two different contexts in which I'll be speaking about today. So while visual plagiarism as a term may be new to some of you, I promise you, and I'm going to show you some examples that will demonstrate that as a concept, you're actually quite familiar with visual plagiarism and maybe more familiar with it than you thought. That being said, I would be willing to bet that most of the participants today have a fairly good understanding of plagiarism generally. And I just want, if you would just humor me and take a minute or two, and I'll ask Sarah to help me out with this. What are some of the first things that come to mind when you hear the word plagiarism? I'm not necessarily asking for a definition, but if you say, what's plagiarism? What are the first things that pop up? And I'll pause just a minute to give people time to think and to respond about that.
Just to recap, as folks type into the chat, I'll read out what they say for the purposes of the recording because the chat isn't captured in the recording. So feel free to share your thoughts.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, so folks have started chiming in on the chat here. We have an intentional or unintentional mistake. We have using material that is not self-generated. We have failure to give credit. Someone said, I first think of writing. Someone else has written copying. Someone has said using others' ideas without giving proper attribution.
Great, great. All very valid points. The piece about intent is really interesting, and we could have a whole conversation dedicated to intent or not. And I'm chomping at the bit to get into that, but I'm not going to. What I am going to do is I want to grasp on the piece about somebody said, I first think of writing. And that is so common. You are by no means alone when you first think of writing. And if you ask our students at the university level, what do they think of when they think of plagiarism? Many of them, not all of them, of course, but many of them, their first thought will go to writing and text-based plagiarism. So, you can define plagiarism in 1,000,001 different ways. Here is a fairly lengthy definition that I have taken. We're not going to go through this definition. I'm sharing it here for you, just for reference purposes. We at Ryerson have what's called Senate Policy 60, academic integrity. So our academic integrity is a Senate policy. It's got the real fun and exciting name of Policy 60. This has a fairly lengthy definition of plagiarism, and it says it includes but is not limited to, and there's all these various points here. I want to focus on one of those only, and it says claiming, submitting, or presenting words, ideas, artistry, drawings, images, or data of another person, including information found on the internet and unpublished materials, as if they are one's own without appropriate referencing. So I know that's a little bit of a mouthful, but what I want to do is just point out to you that this definition includes far more than writing. And I think that is really important, and it is something that I will discuss with students all the time, that when we think about plagiarism, although many of us will absolutely first think about writing and text-based plagiarism, plagiarism comes in all sorts of shapes, sizes, and colors. So just a little bit about text-based plagiarism. It's the one that many of us are familiar with, and many of us are most familiar with text-based plagiarism. And if you think of text-based plagiarism, it is actually the one that is best supported at most of our institutions. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is text-based plagiarism is usually included in the definition of plagiarism, if there is a definition of plagiarism in your policy, if in fact you have a policy. The other thing is many of our institutions will have originality detection softwares. There are many different types of originality detection software. I'm showing you a screenshot here from the one that we happen to use at Ryerson currently, which is Turnitin. There are many different softwares out there. Many of our institutions will support these softwares, which, there's a financial aspect to this. This is not free. Our institutions, on the other hand, do not support similar detection systems for things like visual plagiarism for a lot of different reasons. One of the very simple reasons is that there isn't actually a really great one out there. And you know what? I should take that back, right? I misspoke there. What I should say is the softwares that exist are not as universal, let me put it that way, than the softwares for detecting text-based plagiarism or that look at originality in writing. So text-based plagiarism is something that is really familiar to most of us. If we look outside of academia, plagiarism is actually fairly common in the world. Fortunately or unfortunately, as the case may be, plagiarism is often in the news. And it might sound a bit of a funny sort of thing to say, but I like when plagiarism in the news. And I like it when it's in the news because we all know what happens. Unfortunately, it happens every day in academia. And I think the more of a conversation about plagiarism, not specifically within academia, but broadly speaking, the better, right? That people are aware of plagiarism, and not just plagiarism, of course, but academic integrity and academic misconduct broadly. But I like seeing these things reported in the news. I'm not pleased to see that they have happened. I'm pleased to see that there is a conversation about them. Here's one fun example that some of us may remember from the 2016 election, where Melania Trump, former First Lady of the US, was accused of plagiarizing Michelle Obama former First Lady's speech as part of the 2016 US presidential campaign. And if any of you happen to watch the side-by-side videos, the similarities between the speeches were really quite striking. One that's in the news right now and has been really widely reported in the UK and Ireland is a case that's ongoing at the moment. Many of you will be familiar with Ed Sheeran, the singer, the artist. He has a song that, again, many of you will know. It's called Shape of You. Himself and his co-writer, Johnny McDaid, from the Northern Irish band Snow Patrol, they have been accused of stealing the hook from a different artist called Sammy Switch, who released their song called OY back in 2015. And it is ongoing in the High Court. We are awaiting judgment. So judgment is coming any day on this. And this will tell you where my interest lie. I'm sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for that judgment. I kid you not, I cannot wait because I find it fascinating. And it's not that I have a particular horse in this race. It's not that I am rooting for somebody to win this case. I'm fascinated to see how this will turn out and what the judge has to say about this. So this is one that's ongoing right at the minute. And then something that relates specifically then to visual plagiarism is an example that Sarah, our host and facilitator, made me aware of just a couple of weeks ago, is a really particular interesting example. Many of us will be somewhat familiar with the country Croatia in Southern Europe. Croatia joined the EU, the European Union, in 2013. Many of us will know across the EU is the single currency called the euro, and Croatia is planning on joining the Eurozone next year in 2023. To mark or to celebrate that, the mint or the bank within Croatia, held a competition to design the logo for the various Croatian euro coins. You can see here in the image, what we have is here, the logo of a marten standing on a branch. And that was intended to be, this was one of the contest winners, and that was intended to be for, I believe it was the €1 coin. And the idea behind that was it was supposed to be an ode to the current currency of Croatia, which is called the kuna, or the kuna, which translates to a weasel type animal, the fur of which, or the skin of which, was used as currency in the Middle Ages. Now, the problem that has arisen is, or the controversy that has arisen is that this image, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but this image here in the coin looks strikingly similar to a picture taken by a British photographer, Ian Leach. So when this became public, the contest winner decided to withdraw their entry. The reason they did that was they cited a toxic environment in social media. That is why they withdrew their entry, which, you know, that's unfortunate that that happened. The photographer, once the entry was withdrawn, was satisfied and has decided to take no further legal action. But this is a really interesting and neat, dare I say it, example of visual plagiarism. So moving forward then, what do we know about visual plagiarism, and what does the literature say about visual plagiarism? Well, to be honest, it doesn't say a whole lot. Increasingly, particularly in the past 10, 20 years, there has been a huge increase in the amount of literature on academic integrity and academic misconduct, which has been a really fantastic thing to see. A lot of that, well, the vast majority actually of that literature is based upon text-based plagiarism. Increasingly these days, that literature is based on contract cheating, which of course is, you know, a really salient topic for those of us working in higher education. However, very few published studies focus specifically on visual plagiarism. I've listed just a couple here. There are more. Blytheman, Oren Mullen in 2007, developed discipline-specific guidelines on visual plagiarism. Garrett and Robinson was actually trying to test some of the tools that are available to try and help identify and prevent visual plagiarism. And then Eaton, 2017, by Sarah, showed that only 6 of 20 institutions surveyed explicitly include visuals in their policies around academic integrity, which is a real gap, right? That's a real problem. And At the risk of self-aggrandizing once again, I will speak about Ryerson 2019. So myself and some colleagues at the university recognized this as problematic. So we published a guide in 2019 called Best Practices on Preventing Visual Plagiarism, and that is freely available as well, that particular guide. So what I want to do now then is move forward and talk a little bit about visual plagiarism within the disciplines. And as I said, I'm not an expert on any of these disciplines specifically, but what I do want to talk about are some of the issues around visual plagiarism, and then some educational strategies. And of course, the discipline-specific experts are my co-authors who I've already mentioned. So this is what we will talk about. Text-based presentation courses. We will talk about digital media, we will talk about illustration, and then architecture, and we have some fun and interesting examples to take a look at as well. So almost all of us at some point in our life will have or will give a presentation on using something like PowerPoint, Google Slides, Keynote, whatever that is. And some of us are better than others. I would imagine the folks in this call are probably better at including citations in their presentation materials. Most of this group is probably pretty good at that. However, across the sector in higher education, we are failing at including citations and references in our presentations. If and when we do include citations in our presentations, priority is given to, guess what? Our text resources and our text sources, not our visual sources and resources. And who does it? All of us, myself included. And when I say us, I do mean us. I mean me too, right? I am just as guilty as anyone of this. Faculty, students, and the institution. All of the time you see no sources listed whatsoever in our presentations, or if you see sources listed, the priority is given to our text-based sources. Why is that? That's a problem. Well, we know why that is, right? I'll give you a really simple example of a conversation that I hear time and time again in my office. So as Sarah mentioned, I work at the Academic Integrity Office at Ryerson, and we're a neutral office. And what we do is we help to administer our academic integrity policy, that policy 60 that I mentioned earlier. And one of the things we will do is we will facilitate conversations between faculty members and students if and when there is a suspicion of academic misconduct. So a given conversation might be, okay, we will talk about a text-based assignment. We'll say there's an essay that has been written. And we talked a little bit already about originality detection services. So originality detection service has been used, and it has given an originality score. The faculty member has looked at the report, and they now have a belief that plagiarism may have occurred. Excuse me, so they now want to have a discussion with the student about this potential plagiarism. Excuse me, and my office, myself, and one of my colleagues will be there to helping to facilitate this conversation. And the faculty member might say something along the lines of, I notice here you appear to have used this particular source, but you haven't included the reference. Can you tell me about that? Why is that? And then the student says, with no hint of cheek, they say, but you don't include references either. And the faculty member then sometimes gets their back up and says, what do you mean? I absolutely always include references. And the student says, but I go to your lectures every week and you have slides and there's never been a reference, never once on your slides. That student has a point. They really do have a point. Now, I'm not saying the student hasn't engaged in plagiarism, but they have a point. They're doing what they see, or they're not doing what they don't see, right? So we need to get better at this ourselves. So in terms of our some of the challenges around visual plagiarism, the text-based presentation courses, let's talk about them. So there's preloaded softwares, clip arts, there's images from websites, and then there's personal creations. What are some of the things that we need to think about when it comes to each of these things? Well, our preloaded softwares and clip arts, typically they don't need to be cited, typically, right? The images that we're using in our presentations. However, it's important that our students track what they are using. Is a particular image that they're using, is it a preloaded clip art that is embedded within the software, the presentation software, or is it something that they've taken from a website, for example? So they need to track it. And we teach this when we teach writing and when we teach research skills. We say track your sources. So it is the exact same thing. Track your sources when you're using visuals. As I've said, it could be an image from a website or images from websites. I have quite a few images from websites today that I'm using. And again, motivate your students to build a practice of citing the visuals, right? And you can reward them for this, right? If you are asking students to present as part of an assignment for a course, build it into the grading scheme. Be very, very clear and very explicit that this is a requirement, and then teach them to do it. Show them how to do it, right? When you are presenting yourselves. Personal creations, again, typically don't need citation. And this is something I'm going to come back to later. It's important for the student to ask themselves, is their personal creation entirely theirs, or has it been heavily inspired by an external source? And this is something I'm going to come back to later. If it has been heavily inspired by an external source, maybe then it does need a citation of some sort. The other thing is advise students to place copyright or Creative Commons indicators on their visuals if they would like them to be shared. So broadly speaking then, within your courses, within your programs, within your schools, where you can, try and create a unified visual plagiarism standard, a standard of what is expected of your students and a standard methodology for them to do it. I mean, again, if we think about something like how to cite in text-based courses, right? Many of our courses, for example, in psychology, folks use APA. In history, is it Chicago, I think they use in history, or MLA? My point is there is a standard. That is the point that I am trying to make. Now, you, of course, are not, you as an individual, you are not responsible for the standard of how to cite visuals in presentations the world over, but you do have agency within your own courses and maybe within your own programs and departments. So I think have those conversations where you can. Instructors lead by example, right? So we need to be the ones who are showing students how to do this, and then you know, walk the walk. Don't just talk, and actually include those citations ourselves, and then provide students with the tools to be successful. Help them, show them how to do it. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about digital media and visual plagiarism within digital media. And this is one in particular where visual plagiarism and copyright infringement overlap quite a bit, and I'll show you some examples. So when you think about visual plagiarism in digital media or courses in digital media, for some of us who are maybe Generation X or maybe a little bit older, you know, digital media isn't something we grew up with per se, but it is something that we are surrounded with, and it is inescapable. So these courses may include things like social media, web design, video game design, excuse me, or mobile application design. And so then some of the problems that we can see in with respect to visual plagiarism in digital media is inappropriate use and attribution of digital versions of physical media. That's a real mouthful. Digital versions of physical media. What do I mean by that? Do you remember photographs? Do you remember do I have one? I actually do. Hard copy photographs. We all know in this day and age what a physical photograph is. So a digital copy of a physical photograph. Illustrations, paintings, maps, videos, logos. Many of us have seen digital images of paintings. How many of us have ever seen an image of Mona Lisa smoking a cigarette, for example, right? That's the type of thing that I'm talking about here. And then, of course, inappropriate use of uniquely online media, social media posts, memes. How many of us have ever seen a meme with a citation? I have not, never in my whole life. And if you have, I would be delighted to hear about it, and I would love to see it. If you have seen a meme with a citation. So there's things like emojis, collages, web pages, mobile app layouts, banners, advertising graphics, all these types of things where visual plagiarism can come into play. Why is it such a problem in digital media? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Copying digital work is technically very, very easy to do. You can copy and paste it, you can save the file and then start working with the file. So technically, it's a really easy thing to do. And then beyond that, it is common practice. We see it every single day. Like I just said, how many of you have ever seen a citation on Instagram, right? Or Facebook? We just don't see these things. And that is the cultural norm. So that is what our students think is acceptable behavior. So in many ways, we're fighting a bit of an uphill battle with this one, but I think these are really important conversations that we need to have with our students. And again, more than many of the other disciplines that I'm talking about today, this one very closely intersects with copyright, trademark permissions, artist permissions, and compensation. So I want to have some conversations, and I want to show you some examples that we can have conversations about. So I'm just going to display this image, and I want to pause for a moment, and I want folks to type in anything they happen to know or think or feel when they see this image. What do you know about this picture? Is the question I'm asking.
Okay, we're getting some responses here in the chat. I've got Andy Warhol screen print of a film still, I think. Got Marilyn by Warhol, Andy Warhol and Marilyn Monroe. Warhol harnessed, and in quotations, errors. That Andy Warhol probably didn't take the original picture. Andy Warhol, photograph turned into an art piece. And then someone put overused.
Okay, so you're all spot on. You are absolutely spot on in everything that you have said. This is a silkscreen print of Marilyn Monroe that has been turned into an artwork. It is now housed in the Museum of Modern Art. Andy Warhol is credited with this image. What less of us know, and nobody has mentioned, and full disclosure, I didn't know this either until I started actually doing this research, and it was one of my colleagues, Glenn Farrelly, who put me onto this one in particular. This image right here, Andy Warhol, that probably made him millions, was based upon this image, a photograph taken by Gene Corman. Guess how much Gene Corman made off of that image? Well, excuse me, let me rephrase the question. Guess how much money he received from Warhol? You got it, zero. Bubkiss. Did he receive accreditation for the use of the image? No, he did not. Absolutely not. I've got a few more of these examples. What do we know about this one? And it just occurs to me, actually, right in this moment, this is the second time I'm referencing the US presidential election campaign in this talk. I want to say that's a coincidence. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Anyway, what do we know about this image? And again, I invite you to type it in the chat, anything you know or want to say about this image.
So the responses in the chat have started to come in. We have Obama by Ferry, and then someone's written that I have a t-shirt with that on it. So that's interesting. Somebody else wrote, yeah, someone else wrote lawsuit pending. And we have other comments include, can't help but think of the follow-up, nope, with other political candidates. And another comment, I'm guessing the same circumstances as the previous work, and another piece of art based off a photograph with uncredited or no collaboration.
You are a clever bunch of people, unsurprisingly. So this case was and is absolutely bananas. And I will try to get this right because it is so convoluted, and you can actually go read about this and more yourself. So yes, somebody mentioned they have a t-shirt with this image on it, which is really interesting. That was part of the lawsuit. So this particular image was created by the street artist Creative. This particular image was attributed to the street artist Shepard Fairey. And there are conflicting reports as to exactly how it came about. According to Shepard Fairey himself, he's a New York-based street artist. He worked quite closely with the Obama campaign to create this image. Again, it depends who you ask exactly how this worked out. He claims that he created it, and I think he said that originally here where it said hope, it said courage, I believe. And then the campaign got in touch with him and said change it to hope, because a hope was a big part of the message in this campaign back in 2008. So he said, yes, no problem. It got changed to hope. The campaign embraced it. It was on posters, t-shirts, buttons, you name it, mugs, everywhere. Then a year later, it was discovered that this image was based upon this particular photograph of Barack Obama that was taken by freelance photographer Manny Garcia, who at the time was working for the Associated Press. And there was a lawsuit. So Shepard Fairey counterclaimed. So to be clear, nobody disputed that, yes, this image was the original source. So that was not in dispute. Well, actually, it was in dispute at one point. Anyway, it was eventually accepted that this image was the original source. However, the artist Shepard Fairey claimed that he had used it under fair use doctrine, and therefore there was no copyright infringement. I misspoke when I said it was accepted that it was this image. It wasn't initially. He being Shepard Fairey, claimed it was a different image that he used, and he got himself into quite a lot of trouble. He destroyed evidence during the investigation that led to separate charges and whatnot. As I understand it, it has since all been settled, but it was a real mess at one point, a real mess. What happened in the end between the Associated Press and Shepard Fairey was it was going to court, and the judge said, I encourage you to settle, because if you don't settle, the Associated Press will win this case. The judge as much said that. So the case was settled, which, I guess that's good, but it's not as fun for us because then we don't get to read the details of the settlement or exactly what happened. But you can bet a lot of money changed hands in that settlement. I've got just two more. This is a particularly fun one. Does anybody recognize this image? And again, I want to pause for just a moment.
We've had some comments come in through the chat that the monkey took a selfie, monkey who took his own photo. People are saying they recognize it. The monkey took the image themselves, selfie by the monkey.
Exactly, monkey selfie. And if you Google monkey selfie, this is what you will find, and a whole slew of articles about monkey selfie and the series of court cases that revolved around monkey selfie. So this monkey was named Naruto, named by PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. There you go, I got there. The monkey was named Naruto by PETA. So let me get this right. The monkey took the picture using the equipment of British nature photographer David Slater. And there was a lot of different questions about who then owned the copyright. Did the monkey own the copyright? And that was what PETA was arguing as part of the court case. The photographer, David Slater, argued that he owned the copyright. It was his equipment. He traveled to Indonesia. He befriended the tribe, group, I don't know what the collective name for monkey is, this family of monkeys, and engineered the situation, allowing the selfies to be taken. Wikimedia published the picture on Wikipedia, a series of pictures. They argued it belonged in the public domain because a monkey cannot hold the copyright. Long story short, this actually, if you ask the experts, this is still quite a controversial set of cases. It was eventually all settled out of court. There was a series of appeals that ruled against PETA, and please don't take this the wrong way, I'm not trying to knock PETA, but in the judgment, what they said was that PETA was not doing this for the interest of the animal, but they were doing it for the interest of themselves and their own promotion. And they did, however, rule that a monkey cannot hold the copyright. So then I ask you, who owns the copyright then? If not the monkey, is it the photographer, or does it then belong in the public domain? So it's a really, really interesting question. And I'm not sure that I actually have the answer to this particular one. And there's one more I want to show you, just because it really, really made me laugh. And I have a link to a CBC radio story that if you have a spare 7 or 8 minutes, you really should listen to. So let me tell you what happened with this particular one. So what happened was, you could see this image here of a quote unquote hipster. So MIT magazine published a study, and in this study, they claimed that all hipsters look the same. And they created a mathematical model that said that everybody who tries to go against the norm and is countercultural ends up looking like everybody else who was also claiming to be against the norm and countercultural. That was the mathematical model that they published. And with that, this particular picture was used, and it was used legally, and it was used through Getty Images. After this was published, an individual tried to sue the magazine. He called the study tired cultural trope, and he claimed that his picture here, him in the beanie, was being used illegally, and he was suing for slander. Turns out it wasn't him in the picture, which just really made me laugh. And in fact, in many ways, kind of proves the point of the study. But anyway, that is neither here nor there. So moving along then, what I wanted to try and do with that series of examples is show you that you may actually be much more familiar with visual plagiarism than you realize, because nearly all of you knew the images, and many of you knew that some of these images were controversial and that there were claims and various counterclaims. The other thing I wanted to do was try and show you the intersection between visual plagiarism and copyright infringement. Now, within our institutions, we are more concerned with visual plagiarism because we're more concerned with our own policies. At the same time, what we're doing is we are educating our students to go out into the world and to be working professionals. We do not want our graduates, because of a poor education, to then go and get sued because of copyright infringement. That is, of course, the last thing we want. So some challenges with visual plagiarism in digital media are the following. Instilling a concern that crediting creators is important. Having conversations with your students about that. And one of the ways in which we could do that is appeal to the students as content creators. Most of our students are current as well as future content creators. How would you feel if that was your image? If you were Jean Cornman and you had took that photograph of Marilyn Monroe, and then somebody like Andy Warhol came along and made millions off of that, how would you feel? What would you do about that? And I think that's a really interesting conversation to have with your students. Getting into the weeds, which we're not going to do today, but getting into the weeds with your students on the difference between open access, royalty-free, public domain, and copyrighted media, I think, again, is a really important conversation. I talked about free use doctrine. What does that actually mean? Earlier on, I mentioned Creative Commons. What does that mean as well? And we're not going to go into all of that today, but these are conversations that you really should be having, or I recommend that you have with your students. How do we credit in academic settings? And then how do we credit in professional settings? And as I mentioned earlier, the lack of convention is problematic, right? We do have conventions when it comes to crediting text-based sources like APA, MLA, Chicago style, whatever that is, but we don't have a similar convention for crediting are visuals. So that is what I'm saying within your classroom, if nothing else, create a convention, be very, very clear, included in your course outline, included in your assignment instructions, give examples. This is how I want you, show students, this is how you need to credit your visuals. And as well as that, then assign marks to it, right? Use of third-party media. When is it okay? When is it not okay? And again, you can address this in your assignment instructions. And then a big question that we're going to talk about a little bit more now is proper use or reuse or sufficient departure. When is enough of a departure enough of a departure? And again, I'd love to be able to tell you the answer, but I can't tell you the answer, right? So if you're designing something based upon a referential design, how much do you have to change it? I don't know, because I'm not a designer, but these are the conversations that you want to try and have with your students. So before we move on from digital media, please impress upon students the need to counter prevailing norms. And we see these norms and we participate in this every single day when we post and repost and share all these memes and all these images on things like Twitter, Instagram, and others. And, you know, we're part of it, right? So talk to students about that. And you know what, maybe it is okay to post a meme, but what if you are hired later on in life and you're responsible for social media for a particular company and then you get sued? Well, you're probably going to lose your job, right? So we certainly don't want that to happen. Okay, moving along to within the disciplines, visual plagiarism in illustration. And this again is another tricky one. So if we think not just about illustration, if we think about painting, for example, how is it for hundreds of years, hundreds and hundreds of years, how have people been taught to paint? Think about the great painters of the Renaissance, Da Vinci and the like. They had apprentices, didn't they? And what did the apprentices do? Mimicry, copying. That is what they did. And to some extent, that is still what happens today. But there's a difference between learning by mimicking, learning technique, learning method, versus developing your own style. And that's not always clear to our students, right? To complicate it further, there are some types of mimicry or copying that maybe are okay, maybe. So we have parody, which is in many ways an acceptable form of copying because it is intentional, but it is done so adding humor and never pretends to be anything other than the original with humor added, right? It is quite intentional. And, you know, in a parody, the person who has created the parody is not claiming that this is entirely their own. Similarly, with satire, you have criticism involving humor. And then we have appropriational. So we have intentional borrowing with alteration. And then I repeat the question, how much, of an alteration is enough? Before we go much further, though, I want to show you a couple of examples here. Does anybody know what a croaky is? You may or may not. Once again, I have learned. I did not know this. Now I do.
Someone has written in the chat, Pokemon, question mark?
You know what? That might have been my answer. So a croquis, which is a hand-drawn sketch of a live model, right? So in this particular assignment, in illustration, this here is a student submission of a croquis. And a croquis is, as I have said, it is a hand-drawn sketch of a live model. So this is the croquis that was submitted. Oops. Okay, this now is the process work that was submitted along with the croquis. And I don't know how well you can see the photographs, but there are two photographs that are circled here that are supposed to be the basis for these particular images. So the professor has a real eagle eye. And what they noticed is, okay, you see this, can you see my cursor above this one image? This was supposed to be the photograph that the student had taken to draw this one. Does anyone see the problem between this and this? Well, it's the wrong arm. So if you look, you see the arm that is lifted here and the hand that is by the shoulder, it's the wrong one, right? The other thing which you may or may not be able to see here is this one in the middle here is supposed to correspond to this. You may not be able to see it, but I can tell you, here we have a closed fist, here we have a finger pointing. So it is a sharp eye that was able to catch this. And then with some reverse image searching, here we find what the student has copied. Sarah, I can see your face. I felt the exact same way. Blew my mind, right? But this is the discipline-specific expertise, right, that this particular faculty member brings to this. They were able to identify that because they were looking out for this. So it was by using a reverse image search that they were able to show that what had happened was the student had probably done something like a Google search for a croquis, had found this image, copied this image, submitted that, and then after the fact, taken these photographs and submitted them as process work. It's fascinating. I'm a scientist, but I'm a lab scientist, I guess. I'm a scientist by training. Like I said, I struggle to draw stick man, so I find all of this stuff really, really fascinating. So again, how much of a departure from the original is enough? And not just within illustration or fashion illustration, all of these are really important conversations to have. You know, I said earlier, if you think about painting, the way in which people studied and learned to paint for years was through mimicry. If you think about fashion, many of us will be familiar with the concept, at least, of a knockoff. So if you're not familiar with that particular term, if you think, you know, I don't want to name one, but if you think about a high-end designer that releases something as part of a fashion show, and then, you know, let's just say it's a dress, and you can spend $5,000 to have that dress, or you can go onto the high street and you can go to a retailer and you can buy the same dress for $100. Well, what has happened there, right? That retailer, that high street retailer, has created what we call a knockoff, right? And sometimes it's not a high street retailer. Sometimes you're buying these things out of the back of a truck, right? That is really commonplace within fashion. And I don't think it's a hard sell for most of us to understand as to how and why that is problematic. But my colleague Colleen has suggested what I think is a really neat, elegant way of having this conversation with your students about how much to change and how much is enough. Pick a design project, whatever it is within your discipline. Ask yourself, what are the common elements within that design project? And it could be, and you know, this is a very short list. There's a much longer list in our book chapter. We have color, lighting, setting, context, feeling, scale, fabric. Ask students to base their project on an existing project, but ask them to change 3 of these and change them enough so that it is enough. And then you as the faculty member or the professor get to decide how much is enough. But again, have those conversations with people, with your students, get them to practice doing it so they don't go out into the real world and the university is real world. So they don't go out into the working world and then find themselves in trouble later on down the line. Okay, so the last discipline I want to talk about today then is architecture. And much like painting, which has been taught by mimicry, architecture is an evolutionary discipline that builds upon past precedent and has done for hundreds, if not thousands of years, I think we could say. That being said, plagiarism in architecture as a case, the first case came forward in the 1950s in California. Now, if you think about the common elements of a building, any particular building, if we think about a very basic building structure, you're going to have 4 walls, you're going to have a floor, a ceiling, a roof, and you're going to have 1 or more lighting fixtures from the ceiling. So if we accept all of those as common elements, and then you ask 10 different architecture students to go off into, you know, their own space and design a room, they're going to come back and those rooms will not look the same, nor should they look the same. And that's because these students are going to think about the value of space versus these commodity components. Okay, so when we think about visual plagiarism in architecture, we have to accept the fact that there are these commonalities, and that is okay that there are these commonalities, but it's what the architecture does with these commonalities. And again, I want to show you just a couple of different examples. So in this project that I'm about to show you, I'm going to show you some student work. Students were asked to design a pavilion. And this is one submission from one student, which I actually thought was really neat when I first looked at it. I really, really liked the structure. I thought this was fantastic. Again, I am by no means an architect. I'm far from an architect. Then the professor showed me from within the same class that had been offered online, another student submission of the same project. Here we go. And I kind of thought, well, these two students work together, was my first thought. And the professor said, no, they didn't. They work completely independently. And I said, well, how is that possible? And he said, they both copied this, which is quite a famous design. It's the Rounds Theatre Pavilion in Illinois. It was built in 2016. It's located at an artist colony about 30 miles north of Chicago. But what was interesting in each of these cases was, and if we look at the three of them here together, you can see just how similar they are. And, you know, I've said, I'm not an architect. I don't think you need to be an architect to look at, you know, to be able to identify the similarities in these three designs. But what was interesting in each of these cases was in one of them, the student freely admitted to have using the Round Theatre and said, oh yeah, that's an existing structure. I based mine off of that. What is the issue? The other student claimed that theirs was an original thought, right? Or an original idea. But it was interesting though to me that the student, again, even though I'm not an architect, I can see how close these designs are. And it doesn't seem okay to me that they are that close, but yet this architecture student seemed to think it was okay that they were this close. Very, very briefly, another one here, this is the same assignment. Students were asked to design a pavilion. You can see this bolded line here, and you see this one particular line at an angle that seems to be completely out of place here. When questioned about why that line was in, you know, was like that, the student, the student provided their process work, and you can see here the same line at the same angle. The professor was able to find here this original design from actually quite a well-known architecture tutorial that is available on YouTube. And he was able to identify here, this is where the student had copied this particular design. So just like all of the other disciplines, there are challenges with respect to visual plagiarism that are unique and some that are common. So when we think about these various challenges, what are they? Well, you can have work that is similar to others, like in the example that I had shown. And one of the things you could do, and as I understand is quite common practice in architecture, is for students to include a document that showcases the evolution of their design. And if you think about that with respect to our written assignments that many of us are familiar with, many of us ask for drafts, we ask for research notes, we ask for things like proposals. It is the exact same process that we are asking for, right? If students have student work similarity, showcase similar projects and student work as preventative. So again, at the various stages, ask students to present the work that they are working on. And if it happens that student work is similarity, what a student work, you know, between students is similar, have a conversation about that. Is it a coincidence? Is it not a coincidence? But again, get in there early and have that conversation with your students. If you have similarity in layout, assign marks to layout, right? You know, making it clear that you expect a unique layout. If there's a lack of citation, plain and simple, require the citations, and again, include grades or marks for the citations. Group work is apparently very, very common in architecture, and group work in terms of academic integrity and plagiarism has its own set of problems that is not unique to visual plagiarism, as you may know. One of the things we often encounter at the Academic Integrity Office at Ryerson is you have a group project and what I am most familiar with is a written group project. And then we have one section where it appears there's plagiarism, there's no citations, there's no quotation marks, whatever it is. And then the professor says to me, who is responsible for this? Is it the individual who wrote that, or is it the group? Get out ahead of that, right? Use things like a group work charter, and it's the same, it's the exact same thing, right? Ask students to develop this or to figure out this and to decide upon all of this right from the get-go. Finally then, time management, set milestones and ask students for to display their work and to show their work at various points. Don't just ask for the final product. And I mean, I think that's just good teaching practice, regardless of visual plagiarism. So I'm almost done. I think I'm going to wrap it up shortly. And I know we've got lots of time for questions and discussion, but where do we go from here? I think is a great question to ask ourselves. And, you know, I've talked a lot about 4 different disciplines. And as I've said, there are many things unique to each of those disciplines with respect to visual plagiarism and the instructional strategies, but there are many, many things that are common. So some overarching themes that I would like to leave you with before we get into questions and discussion is to please include discussion of visual plagiarism in training. Many of us at our institutions will have various orientations. We will do things in our classes at the beginning of the term on the first day where we will go through our course outlines and whatnot, and we will often talk about plagiarism. But really what we mean is text-based plagiarism when we have those conversations. Be explicit. Talk about visuals. If you're asking students, for example, to give presentations in PowerPoint or Google Slides or whatever it is, be very, very clear on your expectations and requirements around references and citations, not just for the textual elements of the presentation, but also for the visuals. Develop norms and standards where possible. Again, this really isn't something that exists within our institutions, and you are not necessarily responsible for creating the norm for your institution, but at minimum, you can in your own classroom. And if you can within your own classroom, maybe have a conversation with your colleagues, right? Can you create a norm within your department, within your program, within your faculty, whatever the case may be? Again, some of you will have more involvement in this than others. Go take a look at your policy. Is there any mention of visuals in your policy? If there's not, is there an opportunity for policy review? Can this be something that is raised at the next policy review? Or why wait till the next policy review? Raise it now. Send them a link to our book chapter. I'm shameless, Sarah, aren't I? And finally, then continue the conversation. Because there is so little, not nothing, but because there is so little out there on visual plagiarism, I was really just absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to write this, co-write, this book chapter, and then to come here today to speak with all of you about this topic. So I think I'll stop there. Before I go any further, I just again want to thank you all so very, very much for your time and attention this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, and to thank Sarah and Helen for hosting me today. I believe we've got another 25 minutes or so scheduled, and I am more than happy to stay on for that full time if there's discussion or questions. So thank you very much all.
Thank you so much. And we do have some comments in the chat that I'll pose to you. And speaking of giving credit where it's due, I recognize that I did not give credit to Helen Petherick at the beginning of the session today. Helen is our webinar production coordinator. These webinars don't organize themselves, so I just wanted to give a shout out to Helen. Thank you for all of the work you do to make this possible. And to get us started with further contemplations around the discussion, we had a comment come in that I wanted to get your take on, and it's coming from John in the text. And he says, original actually meant being faithful to origins rather than being different as we intend today by the term. And I wondered if you might comment on that.
That's a really, really interesting point, John. You see, I'm not trying to dodge the question, I promise you. I hesitate because So much of what I have said, and as I've tried to preface at the beginning, it's not for me to tell people what is and is not visual plagiarism within your discipline. What I'm trying to do is encourage the conversation. So the question of what is and is not original, however you want to define the word original, it's a really difficult one for me to answer. I mean, I think about the fashion one, for example. If you have two dresses and one designer says, my dress was inspired by this person's dress, and then the original designer says, well, that's just a knockoff. They've copied me. How much of a change is required? And I don't have the answer to that, but what I do want to do is encourage those conversations, particularly in the classroom. Sorry, John, I'm not giving you a direct answer at all.
Oh, super. And I'll invite John to respond to that. We've also had something come in from Chris, who's leaving a couple of comments here, who said that the title of today's session could also have been called Visual Plagiarism. What is it and what can we do with it? And has also left a further comment in the chat that might have more context or sense for you than it does for me, but I'll share it anyway. It's Walter Benjamin with mechanical reproduction aura, and aura is in quotation marks. So I wonder if you might have any thoughts that are rolling around in your mind about the notion of mechanical reproduction aura.
I'm not sure I do.
And Chris has further clarified that they teach architecture and urban design.
You know what, Chris? I would respectfully defer to my colleague, Vince, who I don't know if he's on the call. He is the architect who was the co-author. And I would be more than happy to put you in touch with Vince if you would be interested in having a conversation with him. I'm not an architect, sorry.
Chris has just said, yes, please. So maybe, John Paul, if you have access to your chat, we could include your email address. Yeah. And if not, then folks can get in touch with me. I'll put my email address in the chat. And I can always put you in touch with John Paul, who can put you in touch with Vincent. So I'm
sure, and I'm just
Calgary. There we go. Thank you. You were faster than I was. Super. And as we're waiting for others to chime in with their thoughts around this, as you were talking, John Paul, I'm going to push the envelope and put you on the spot a little bit because I know you can take it and you'll play along with me. There was a project that came out of the University of Calgary's Digital Media Lab a few weeks ago. And they did an experiment, and they had an artificial intelligence write an article that they posted on their blog. And they then asked people that were involved with the digital communications lab if what their thoughts were. They didn't reveal that the piece had been written by an artificial intelligence, but they said, we're going to talk with the author in our Twitter chat. Sure. Or tell you about the piece in the Twitter chat. In the meantime, they went and created a Twitter profile and used a different artificial intelligence tool that had the AI select its own name. So it selected the name of Alisor South, and then they gave Alisor South a Twitter handle. So I'll put Alisor's Twitter handle in the chat. And then they had used a different AI tool to self-create an image, a photograph of what Alisor looked like. So the AI chose its own name, created its own image of itself, and wrote its own article. And I believe they use different AI tools to do that. But it reminded me that I'm seeing more and more of these artificial intelligence tools that can, say, create a face for fake news or other kinds of, deep fakes, those kinds of things. And my question to you is, what role, if any, do you see artificial intelligence playing in all of this? And how might it complicate or make more exciting the conversations we have with our students? Sorry, that's a big question. So have at her.
It is a big question, and I'm delighted you have asked it. I can take it because I have an answer for you. So I am so lucky that I have some of the most really curious and dedicated colleagues. And one of the co-authors on this chapter, Alison Miller, who may or may not be here. I don't think she was able to make it today. She has a particular interest in artificial intelligence with respect to academic integrity. And recently, Alison has formed a Senate subcommittee at our university to investigate artificial intelligence with respect to academic integrity. Recently, she created a video, which I'm fairly sure Alison would be okay with my sharing it. So once I get her permission, Sarah, I can send it to you, and then you can disseminate it as you wish. It's just a 5-6 little minute video where Alison takes one of these artificial intelligence tools, gets it to generate a paper, and then runs the paper through an originality detection service, which comes back with a score of 0. The paper, now it may not be an A+ paper, however, the student would pass with this paper. So in this particular example, and I know I'm getting off the topic of visual plagiarism specifically, but in this particular example, all the student need do is type in some keywords, some parameters, and then the artificial intelligence will generate the paper for them. So what is the role of artificial intelligence in all of this? That is something we're investigating right now, but I will be honest with you, that shook me. That 5-6 little minute video that Alison created for us to demonstrate this, it really, really shook me. And it showed me and all of us that really what we need to do is think about our assessments. What is it that we are trying to do with our assessments? And I told you that I used to be an educational developer, but many of us, when we think about our assessments, we go back to our learning outcomes. So if you ask me, what is the point of assessment? What is the purpose of assessment? Well, there are many reasons. First and foremost, to my mind, the purpose of assessment is to allow you, the professor, and the student to assess the extent to which they can demonstrate the learning outcome. So, is the best way in which we can do that have the student write a paper? I don't know necessarily. And in light of these emerging tools, for those of you who are Terminator fans, I think Skynet is here. I think this is where we are, right? Because they have become, not really, but we have become so advanced with these tools that I think they're going to be a very, very real problem, not just for us folks who have an interest in academic integrity, but across the educational sector more broadly. I think there's a reckoning coming. I think we're really going to ask what it is we're doing with our assessments, right? Because if it's an algorithm that produced it, how does that help anyone?
Well, these are exciting questions, and I know that Amanda's just noted in the chat that there are article spinners that will, modify text or spin text using artificial intelligence. I'm excited. I'll reach out to Alison as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just before I lose the thought, Sarah, my apologies, I certainly didn't mean to interrupt you. So because this is a subcommittee of Senate, there will be a report that is produced, and that report will be public once it's presented to Senate. So once Alison and her committee have publicly presented that report on artificial intelligence and academic integrity, I'd be more than happy to share it with you and others then as they are interested.
Thank you for that. And we've just gotten a grant at the University of Calgary, Teaching and Learning Grant, to study artificial intelligence and the ethics of teaching, learning, and assessment. So we'll also be happy to share back with Alison. And I confess that as we were developing our grant proposal, I thought only about text-based disciplines because that's where I come from. But now you've made me think about how and if we need to expand our work a little bit. So yeah, let's connect around that. Folks, I'm just going to invite any final comments or questions through the chat. We do have a few minutes left. I'm noticing that the chat box has died down a little bit. And you are getting lots of kudos, John Paul, in the text chat box. People have enjoyed the discussion and looking for visual technologies beyond TinEye or reverse image search to further help with the assessment of student work, I'm assuming. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will stay online, but feel free as well. I know that John Paul will be able to see the chat, so feel free to send him kudos and thanks in the chat as well. On behalf of the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, John Paul, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and extending the gratitude to the co-authors of your chapter and those others that you work with at Ryerson. Honestly, Ryerson University is leading the way with this work, not only in Canada, but globally. And I'm just so proud to call you all friends and colleagues, because I continue to learn so much with and from you every time that we connect. So thank you.
You're so very generous, Sarah. I really appreciate that. And thank you to you and all of the work that you do. You're such a tremendous advocate and leader for us. For those of you who haven't heard it, please listen to Sarah's recent piece on CBC Radio, talking about contract cheating and how Canada is really under threat from this industry. So please go listen to that if you haven't already.
Thank you very much for that. And as I normally do, I'll close with a pitch for our next webinar. Our next webinar will be in April, and we'll have an ombuds here to talk about the role that ombuds play in academic integrity case management, and how ombuds might differ for student advocates. And if you don't have either one of those at your institution, what you might want to think about. Helen's put the link to the webinar series in the chat box if you're interested in registering for the next session. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and a special thank you to John Paul, and by extension to your colleagues as well. With that, we'll let everyone get on with their Friday or Saturday, depending where you're signing in from today. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.